All right, hello everybody. So today we're going to begin Unit 2, which is a look at ecology. And so the topic today is going to be kind of an intro into ecology. What are the basic parts? What does ecology encompass? And then we're going to talk today also about the idea of what is called ecological succession. So a basic definition of ecology would just be the study of interactions between the living and non-living parts of ecosystems. So if we look at ecosystems and how they operate, there is a constant interaction between the living parts of the planet and the non-living parts. And ecology is a branch of biology that looks at that. So if we start off, we need to first of all distinguish between kind of the two main parts of an ecosystem or the environment. The first one would be what are called abiotic factors. And so abiotic factors are going to be anything that is not alive within the environment. So if you look at this word a, which means not, and then biotic, we know that bio means live. So these are not living factors. So in this picture here, we might talk about one abiotic factor is the water, right? Water is not alive. We could talk about the atmosphere. That is also an abiotic factor that is part of the environment. The opposite of abiotic factor would be a biotic factor. And so if we look at the word here, bio we know means life. So biotic factors are living factors. So these are going to be things in the environment that are alive. Like in our picture here, we could talk about these sharks, right? Sharks are alive. They are they're a biotic factor in this particular environment. So abiotic versus biotic, one is non-living and the other is living. And again, ecology is the study of the interactions between these factors. So when we look at ecology, we can talk about how it's organized. So we talked about how life has a kind of an organizational or order to it. So the smallest or most simple level of ecology would be looking at an individual species. So maybe we're studying an individual baboon. And then if we wanted to go a little broader, so we're now like kind of broadening our study here, we could then maybe say, well, I'm more interested in looking at what's called a population or a group of organisms that lives together. So maybe an entire group or population of baboons, right? So if we keep going, a population, which is a group of organisms of the same type living in the same area, if we start to look at several populations, right? So maybe we start to look at, okay, well, not just the baboons, but the lions and the, giraffes. And at that point, we're now looking at multiple different populations and how they all interact. That's the community, right? So many groups of different populations that live in the same place, right? So we're just getting gradually more broad as we go up. So I'll let you look at here. Can you pick out some organisms, population, and a community here? Now, talking about organisms in their environment, one of the things we got to talk about are some terms here. The first one here is called habitat. And a habitat is literally where the organism lives, right? So I like to think of it as it's its zip code. Where do we find this particular organism? Now, habitats can change, they can disappear, they can be natural or, of course, man-made or human-made. And so habitat is nothing more than where an organism lives. Now, another related but different term is the idea of a niche. And a niche is kind of more like the organism's job or its role in the environment. So what position or what role does it play within that habitat, right? So how does it procure its food? How does it survive? When is it active, night or day? Is it a predator? Is it a producer? How does it reproduce? All of those things have an effect, of course, on the environment. And so we would think of that as that's kind of its job or its role. So the niche is the job or what role it plays, and the habitat is just where it lives. Now, when we look at the next level of ecological study, now we're going to move up to what's called the ecosystem level. So we went from organism to population to community, and now we're up to ecosystems. And the main thing with an ecosystem is now we're going to start considering, like we said, the abiotic factors. Oops. So we're not only going to be looking at the biotic factors, but also the non-living parts that are part of the environment as well. And so we can talk about different kinds of ecosystems. There are terrestrial ecosystems like we occupy, and there's, of course, aquatic ecosystems. And so, again, the main thing with ecosystems is just the idea of we're now looking at both living and non-living. Now, the fundamental part that drives all ecosystems, and for that matter, drives all life, is energy. And we'll spend a good amount of time later in this unit talking about energy flow within an ecosystem. But for now, we just want to kind of differentiate between two main types of organisms. So all organisms need energy. The first one that we want to look at are those organisms that we refer to as autotrophs. So autotrophs, or producers, like these plants you can see in these trees here, right? These are organisms that can make their own food. So if we look at the word autotroph, right? Auto literally means self, and trough is to feed. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner there. So these are literally referred to as self-feeders. They're producers. And that's because they can do something pretty awesome called photosynthesis, right? And so photosynthesis is just the ability to capture the energy from the sun, which is the main energy source for all the entire planet. Well, producers can take that energy and they can use it to take inorganic molecules, rearrange those molecules into organic molecules that they can use for food, basically sugars. They can make their own food. Now, another type of autotroph would be a chemotroph, which is an organism that does similar. They are able to take chemicals, inorganic chemicals, use those as their raw ingredients to produce their own food, right? The main thing here, of course, is understanding that autotrophs are self-feeders, producers. Now, the other organisms that we find, and there's different types, but if you're not an autotroph, then you're referred to as what is called a heterotroph. So some organisms obtain their energy not from the sun directly, but by eating other things. So you and I are heterotrophs. This little chipmunk here is a heterotroph, as well as this lizard here. So heterotrophs, hetero means other, right, or different, and troph, so other feeders. They eat other things. And we call heterotrophs consumers. Again, we have to consume other things in order to get the energy or the food that we need for our energy. So there's a couple types of heterotrophs that we can differentiate between. So we can start here with this lion. And this lion is an example of what is called a carnivore. And carnivores are just organisms that eat meat. So they eat pretty much only eat other consumers. Right? So the lion preys, it's a predator on other consumers, and of course consumes only their meat. Next in line, we have this adorable little deer here, and deer is an example of what is called an herbivore, or an organism that only eats plants. So an herb is a plant. So an organism that eats only plants is going to be called an herbivore. Right? Now this little cute raccoon here is an example of what is called an omnivore. So some heterotrophs, some consumers can eat both plant and animals, right? So they've got more of a variety, I guess you could say. And so the raccoon here could eat berries or nuts or seeds, but it could also eat small rodents and bugs. So it's going to operate on, by eating many different kinds of organisms. Continuing with our energy flow and different roles. So we could also talk about decomposers. So here we can see an example of a mushroom. Mushrooms are fungi, which are oftentimes decomposers. Decomposers play a really important role because they break down organic material. So when things die, mushrooms and other decomposers begin to return those organic molecules back into the earth so that the next cycle of life, of course, can continue. Now, another type would be scavengers. So here we can see this vulture that's getting ready to feast on this recently dead raccoon. Hope it's not the raccoon from the other slide. It's kind of cute. Anyway, the scavenger here will come in and eat recently dead organisms, right? So they're still fresh enough to be eaten, at least by this vulture. And so that's kind of how they procure their energy. Another one, the last one we're going to talk about here, is something called a detritivore. And detritivore are going to feed on decomposing plant and animal parts. So once it's gone beyond even what a scavenger really wants to deal with, other things like this crab and other insects, for example, are detritivores feeders, where they start to break down and again return those components back into the earth. Now, when we talk about ecosystems, we can talk about characteristic, really large biological ecosystems called biomes. And biomes are just going to be either terrestrial or aquatic, and they're going to be large ecosystem or areas that have similar plant and animals that are found there. And the reason that they have those similarities, the reason that we distinguish different biomes, is based largely on the temperature and precipitation. So if we talk about the desert, for example, the desert is a terrestrial biome. And the desert has a characteristic temperature and precipitation, which is going to dictate what type of organisms we find there. The rainforest, another example of a terrestrial biome, and of course, rainforest is going to have slightly different temperature and precipitation, which is going to lead to different living things that you will find there. Aquatic ecosystems like salt marshes or swamps, they're also going to be distinct based on these characteristics such as salinity, how salty is the water, what are the nutrients available, and how much light is actually penetrating down into the water. So you guys are familiar with some of these biomes. Again, deserts, rainforest. We live here in the deciduous forest in Virginia. And again, large ecosystems that have distinct characteristics. All right, so the last concept we want to talk about today is the idea of succession. And so succession, or ecological succession, is just the natural changes and the replacement of species within an ecosystem. So ecosystems, as they develop or undergo major changes, we can see those changes or those developments, and we call that succession. So if we look here, this is what is called old field succession. Maybe this is an abandoned farm. And if we wait, maybe this next picture here is maybe 3 or 4 years later, we start to see that we're starting to see some changes, right? If we fast forward to maybe 50 or 60 years or more, we're starting to see that the old field or the once farmland is looking nothing like it used to. We can see these changes, and maybe this is several hundred years later. So succession is just the systematic change within an ecosystem, and it is something that can take oftentimes thousands of years. So we're going to distinguish between two types of succession. And the first one that I want to talk to you about is the idea of what's called primary succession. Primary means first, right? So primary succession is going to be the orderly and predictable series of changes where you have a development of a stable ecosystem where there was previously no life. So the key here, you guys, is primary succession begins where there is no soil. Notice how we put that with an exclamation point. So if we're talking about an area that's got bare rock or sand where no life has existed and there is no soil, this is going to tell you that this is primary succession. Now, in order for primary succession to occur, the first thing that has to happen is we're going to start to see what are called pioneer species. You think of pioneer, these are the ones that arrive first. So in the picture here, we can see that we've got this stuff here called lichen, and these are mosses, and these are oftentimes pioneer species that are able to come in and start to weather and break down that rock and begin to form what will be soil. So these organisms are called pioneer species, and they're the first ones that arrive in primary succession. All right, so again, here's our mosses, here's our lichen, again, pioneer species that are starting to weather and break down that rock and make it possible for other living things to kind of come in and take hold. Now, this is an example of a climax community. So we think of it kind of like at the end, although ecosystems are constantly, going through slight changes. But if we see the final stable community where primary succession has kind of reached its climax or its end, that is called a climax community. So you'll still get small changes, but if we look at like this hardwood forest here, essentially we're looking at the final stages or the climax community of succession. So here's a nice little flow chart that you can use for studying. So if you were to see something like this, again, this is primary succession. How do I know that? No soil, right? So notice how we're starting on bare rock. So maybe after a volcano or something like that, where there's no soil, no life. Eventually, we'll start to see some of those pioneer species come in, like those lichen, and they'll start to break up the rock and turn it into soil. And over time, we start to see replacing of different types of species until we hit that climax community where we have a very much more stable and long-term ecosystem, right? So you can see those changes. Big key here, no soil, primary. Now, another type of succession would be what's called secondary succession. And secondary succession is going to be the changes within a community that occur after maybe like a natural disaster or some other event. And the thing to think about again is with this, we are going to be starting with soil. So I really want to try and help you remember the basic difference, right? So if we've got a farm that has undergone, a wildfire and all the crops and trees and kind of burnt down, but the soil still remains, well, at that point, the succession that will occur as that ecosystem redevelops is going to be secondary because there's already soil. So the pioneer species might be a little bit different than we would find in primary. But the main difference between these two is primary starts with no soil and secondary starts where there already is soil. So I like these flow charts to kind of help you hopefully understand this. Here we're looking at secondary succession, right? So again, maybe a forest fire or some other disaster removes a lot of the vegetation, but we still have soil. And if we have this soil now, when succession begins, it's going to be a slightly different process. We're still going to have some pioneer species that are going to come back first. And then over time, we'll start to see changes in that community until we reach our climax community. Again, secondary succession is going to be a little bit faster than primary because primary succession, remember, we have to build soil first, and that can take a really long time to build some good soil. So there's obviously some impacts on succession. So humans impact succession through cutting down trees and removing habitat. So deforestation, we can see that here. Other ways that we affect succession is through the use of fertilizers. So in our agricultural practices, we oftentimes don't always know where that fertilizer that we're adding to our crops are going to end up. And when they end up in lakes and ponds, those fertilizers can actually help or promote growth of algae. And these algae can grow to the point to where they start to take up all the oxygen and they kill off a lot of the other organisms that are needing that oxygen in the pond or the lake. Another issue that we can look at with succession and human impact is the idea of invasive species. So humans often not the smartest individuals in the world. So things like we introduced this plant called kudzu, which overtook and just grew like crazy. So it's been choking out a lot of our native species. In Florida, where I'm from, we've got a major problem with dumb people buying these large snakes and then realizing, I don't really want to deal with this. So they just put them into the Everglades, set them free. And so now there are a big problem with these pythons, which are not native, actually outcompeting some of the other more native species. Right? So that's a look at intro to ecology and succession. So hopefully that helps out, and we will see you all again soon.